case, it looks very good. Well, good evening. We had a little bit of a snag getting our guest in. We're speaking live to State Senator Brian Benjamin. What is the district? Your district, your senatorial district?
Yeah. No.
No, I'm asking Brian. What's Brian's senatorial district? I think
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go right ahead. What's your senatorial district?
Yeah, so I'm senator for the 30th Senatorial District, which covers
Hello.
Central Harlem, East Harlem, and the Upper West Side.
Mhm.
I go
Hey, man,
from
get the sounds
87
on,
to the
baby.
Central Park West, the West Side.
Nice.
We converse up to 162nd and Edgecombe, and I take charge of Central and East Harlem, and then on 98th on the east of the park. About 300,000 residents in total.
Hold on a second, sir. All right, very well. I'm thinking that the processor isn't able to handle so many streams. So, Brian, tell me what. See, everything will work fine now. So, tell me what's going on with in Albany in terms of coronavirus. I'm sure it must have disrupted things rather dramatically. People have to get you couldn't meet.
Absolutely.
So could you go into that a little bit and let us know what you guys had to go through to conclude the session?
Sure. So thanks for bringing it up, Norm. Actually, right now, under normal circumstances, we would have already restarted session this week, and we're in the process of still figuring that out. But right at the end of the session before the budget, we are normally focused aggressively on negotiating with the second floor and the legislature. Obviously, I'm in the New York State Senate on what a budget would look like. We normally would do our respective one-house bills. The Senate would have a one-house bill. The Assembly would have a one-house bill, and we would negotiate with the governor. Given COVID-19 and the impact that it's had, we threw a lot of that out of whack. Social distancing had to get implemented immediately. We started to see some members in the assembly who had contracted COVID-19. There was a lot of concerns about whether or not we might get it. No one knew what was going on, and so we really kind of went into a semi-lockdown, and we did a couple of things. One was we the state office building to outside visitors, which is usually tough because around the time of the budget, that's when you'll have a lot of activists and folks who have serious concerns coming and expressing their concerns. So long and short of us, we ended up having to close Albany off, which was sad, and we ended up sort of kind of curtailing the process, and we did our budget on time. But a couple of things we ended up doing. We did two things. One was that we now have passed a resolution which allows us to electronically, and so we're typically you have to come into Albany, come into the legislative chambers in order to register yourself as present, and all the mechanics of doing that. We've now, with the Assembly, created the process for us to actually be able to do a legislative session online, and so we're in the process of preparing to go back into session, but actually not in Albany, but to doing it remotely. And we'll be sort of, I think, in the next couple of weeks, sort of going back to session. Also, we really, one of the key things we did is we wanted to make sure that people who contracted COVID-19 were able to have sick leave, and that not count against their either their paychecks or count against their actual paid leave. So we passed legislation that would allow that to happen, and we passed a budget that we try to sort of deal with some of the concerns. This is a really tough time, Norm, and one of the things that we are trying to do is make sure that we come back into session and get some things that we can complete, but at the same time, we have a lot of in-district needs. So there are a lot of issues that we're dealing with in the district. I'm focusing on that. Others are focusing on that because clearly, there's so much need and hurt, particularly in districts like mine.
Excellent. Let me ask this question. I know that budget issues get very complicated, but I'm not interested so much in the details of the budget. Happened in terms of the projection for revenues. There must have some new you always are working with models of what you expect the revenue stream to look like in
Right.
the rest of the year or during the year that you're budgeting for. So what have they done to change those forecasts, do you get any help from the federal government, the Department of Commerce, the Department of the Treasury, anybody to help you modify your revenue forecasts?
Sure. So we right now, as you adequately noted, there is a expectation that we're going to be anywhere from 10 to 15 billion dollars less in expected revenue, and so what that ends up meaning is we have a number of choices to make in this budget. What we agreed to do was to say, let's project the budget that we have, and then as we see whether the revenue comes in or not, then make decisions quarterly as to what needs to happen. And so, if we have less revenue, we would have to make decisions to cut some of the budget. And if we receive the revenue that we expect, then the budget will be able to carry on as is. As you might have been hearing from the governor's press conferences, he's very concerned that in all of the stimulus packages that we've received from the federal government, and I believe there's one coming today that the Senate just passed one as well. In none of those bills are there aids to the localities directly. There are resources for hospitals, resources for small businesses, resources for actually this in today's allocation from the Senate looks like it's going to be $25 billion for testing. That money is coming in, but that is not actually money to the states to help deal with their cash, their revenue shortfalls. And so, I guess as we look at how long we expect this New York pause to last, that will have some implication, obviously, on the economy. And so we are trying to see how that all plays itself out. But right now, it's looking pretty bleak. And the city, if you looked at Comptroller Scott Stringer's recent projections, the city is looking at at least a $6 billion shortfall. So that would be a reduction of city resources as well. So this is a tough time, Norm. But we're going to do the best we can under the circumstances. And we are hearing from some of the Democrats in Congress that there is going to be a plan to get some money to the states to help deal with the states' revenue issues. But obviously the devil's in the details, and we have to see if that happens or not.
Well, do you think that most of the delay is coming probably not because there's no interest in working with the shortfalls in the states? Clearly, they don't want major businesses to go bankrupt and destroy the economy. The same thing would one of our biggest employer is possibly the state and the local governments. So
Right.
I don't, from what I've been hearing, and this is on both sides of the aisle. There are no states that are as bad off as New York because we were hit so clobbered by this
Of course.
virus. But
Of course.
there's an interest in making sure there are not, calamitous shortfalls. They have to keep liquidity in the system, even if it turns out to be some kind of, loan program or loan plus subsidy or a grant from the federal government. I'm sure some package will come together. Is there anybody from the congressional caucus from the state? Any word from them as to how they're organizing these estimates and what they're feeding into the loop for the negotiations in Congress? In other words, is
Well,
our
I think,
congressional delegation working on it?
I know you're asking. Well, I know the National Governors Association, Republican governors and Democrats alike, requested $500 billion in aids for the states, and it's my understanding that Speaker Pelosi, Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, and others have been pushing that case. I think the issue is that there's some Senate Republican concerns, Mitch McConnell, where I think to a certain degree they don't want to give states carte blanche to spend the money how they want, and I think they believe that they would rather give direct aid to what they want it to go to, as opposed to giving the states discretion as to how to spend the money under the guise that Republicans don't want this money to be used for things they don't believe should get money, and that's a tough thing. So that's where you get to the issues of they believe we spend too much on education, they believe we spend too much on social services. So they're saying, wait a minute, we don't want to give you money for that. We want to give directly to the hospitals, directly to this, or directly to small businesses, et cetera, et cetera. And that is, I think that's part of the fight here. So, I think our congressional delegation is fighting the good fight, but we don't control the Senate, we don't control the White House, and so I think they're doing the best they can under the circumstances. But let's not be confused. The Senate Republicans, in particular, they don't want the money to go to things like helping with Section 8 COVID-19 type vouchers for those who've been impacted, right? They just don't believe in that fundamentally. They want to have money go towards small businesses, first come, first serve, whether it's in a COVID impacted state or not. I mean, I think there's some level of politics that's part of this equation, which is unfortunate. But what I'm hopeful for is that we will just keep fighting the good fight and doing our best to make the case for New York State.
Well, let's put it this way. I suspect that Republican governors are going to have many of the same problems because
That's right.
micromanaging this is going to be very difficult for them. There may be some controls, I'd imagine, but money is a lovely thing. It's fungible. So
Right.
the rest of the budget can be the funds that are coming in from other areas can that it's, let's put it this way, the money you're already having coming in from the state can be used to go on cover some, how can I put it, objectionable, and I'm not saying that in the absolute, just in terms of some of the opposition you might get in the Senate, some
No, of
objectionable
course.
expenditures, and I don't, and it's not as if New York State's getting nothing in revenue, especially
Right.
after we come out of this. So I don't. I just generally tend to think that, and there are Republican districts, Republican House districts in the state of New York. There are other,
Of course.
your Republican municipalities and counties, and they're all going to be saying the same thing, I would expect.
Right. But there are not any Republican senators out of the state of New York. And I think that's part of where the rub is, right? And so we've got situations, some people were saying, wait a minute, why are states that have no COVID 19 cases or very few, why are they getting COVID 19 resources? And I think that's just part of what the situation is, to be frank. I would argue that the states that are most impacted should get the most of the money. I think it should just be proportional, and that's a common sense way to handle it. But when you're trying to negotiate with a Senate Republican and a Republican governor, I'm sorry, a Republican president, it becomes more complicated. And I know our congressional delegation in New York is fighting a good fight, and I commend them for all the work that they're doing. But this is a tough one.
Well, when do you think that we'll have a better picture of what the needs are actually going to be for the state and the city? I guess it depends pretty strongly on how quickly we can turn around the recovery out of the.
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue is how quickly do we unpause, right? Because we have literally shut the economy down in order to save lives, right? And so, how is there a medical treatment that is coming out anytime soon? Do we have sort of over-the-counter testing that can help. The vaccine we expect is going to take a while to get here, but the as the governor has laid out, you want to smartly reopen the economy to start getting revenue, but you want to do it in a way where you don't put people's lives at risk. And so, that means all of us having to wear masks. That means all of us making sure that we're continuing to do social distancing. That means, getting a sense of who's got the antibody, who through the antibody testing. All the things you try to do to get a sense of where the crisis is, tracing people who are tied to those who have been COVID-19 impacted. We're so behind the ball on all of that, Norm, that getting ahead of the curve in terms of being ahead of where this virus is, I think will help us to sort of reopen the economy safely. Because the last thing we want to do is reopen the economy, and then all of a sudden why after you flatten the curve, and then the curve gets unflattened, and then you got to close the economy again, and then it's not what you want. And so I think this is a tough one. But what I do believe is that I expect whatever we think the numbers are, they're going to be worse. So we're projecting $10 billion. I think it'll be more like 15 to 20. I just think you gotta assume the worst case scenario and try to manage from there.
Well, let's think for a moment about some of the methods that people have been talking about in reopening it. And of course, doctors Fauci and Birx have a fairly detailed plan and a series of phases they want people to go through, and they'll monitor it. And unfortunately, because we were hit the hardest and first, we weren't. Many things that were available just a week or two later made a big difference in other states, so that they're not going to get the kind of blast that we did. So it's going to take us a little bit more time to calm down. Plus, we have some unusual circumstances, especially in the city, because unlike LA, for example, where everybody commutes in little 3,000-pound capsules, we're in subways and buses, and very easy to communicate viruses. So, but I do think that the people in the city have shown a remarkable tolerance for trying to comply with those rules, and I think that they'll do it. I know that the Abbott Labs testing equipment is now being dispersed. I think we're getting one here on 100th Street at the Board of Health across from next to the library, Bloomingdale Library. And that's going to make a big difference. But I also understand there's a new saliva test that's going to be available very shortly. Have you heard anything about that?
No, I haven't, Norm. I'm trying to balance sort of knowing what's going on in the big picture with sort of making sure that my residents on the ground floor are getting fed, and people can track where they're dying. Their dying parents are in nursing homes, etc. So, no, I don't. I'm not up on the latest. I do obviously stay briefed with the governor's daily press conference. And whatever, and obviously trying to make sure we get more testing in my district, because as you do know, Norm, communities of color are being harder hit by the coronavirus, and there are a number of reasons for that. Just sort of poverty and who tends to be the frontline workers who are putting themselves more out there. How are people living? We've had people living 6, 7, 8 plus people in a 2-bedroom apartment. So if someone gets the coronavirus and they're asymptomatic, that spread is much more deadly, right?
Definitely.
So I'm definitely kind of in the loop more on that. But I will say to you, I'm prayerful that common sense would reign, and that economies won't open faster than they should be, and that we really try to get to a sort of 2, 3, 4 minute test, so that we can really try to kind of instant testing, and then that just makes it instant testing with tracing to try to at least get a hold on people who have this virus asymptomatic and are asymptomatic, and try to get them at bay. And obviously, as testing is an issue itself. I mean, the reagents, and some of the key supplies we gotta, our manufacturers have to get from China. So that's a problem, and I know that the governors were trying to work with the president on that. But my main goal, Norm, is to try to mitigate the spread, with decisions that we can make on the ground, as community leaders.
Well, on the issue of this came up on our Friday at 6 p.m. Event where we were discussing this with Mark Levine, and uh, and yes, in the guidelines from the CDC, they have definitely acknowledged that communities of color, the aged, and indigenous populations, which is not too much of an issue in New York City, but certainly within the state of New York, we have Indian reservations that would be affected by that. And all of those groups are part of a requirement of constant and monitoring and testing, because it's felt in many ways that if you are trying to control an outbreak, those are the populations that will show it first. So if you want to
Mm-hmm.
prevent a recurrence or a new outbreak, and to stay on top of that, watching those communities closely is very important. So what I suggested to him was, and there are a lot of cultural and economic reasons as to why the Hispanic community will have extended families living in an single
Mm-hmm.
apartment with abuela all the way down to the granddaughter, grandchildren. And so it's very difficult to isolate them from one another, and very hard with this type of a disease to keep everyone in the family unit from getting it once one is exposed. So what I said to him was, and he's in a unique position because of one of the few um, uh, politicians who have taken the time to speak Spanish well, is to encourage people not to be afraid to be tested, not to
Right.
resist it, and realize you're not going to get in trouble if you're found to be sick. They're going to be able to help you, and I think that's going to be a big issue because we have to get that cooperation, especially in those communities. The the elderly typically will. We're not having any issues with that in our area. We find, for example, at Red Oak, where we usually meet, we haven't had a single case, but that's because they're extremely. The group is very activated and very organized, and they basically aren't putting up with too much baloney. So the other institutions haven't been as lucky, but I do think that there's a people like yourself can help a great deal by just that, community leadership of letting people know it's important, not to be afraid of it, similar to the way we want them to fill out the census forms, and that we're trying to protect these communities because they're the ones that are the most vulnerable. Do you have any, are there any other um, people in the caucus or the New York City caucus who are working on that, on outreach specifically to the communities of color and the elderly, to encourage them to be tested and watch their health?
Sure. So I think a couple things. One, I believe the lion's share of my colleagues who represent communities of color are doing that. I know that they just opened a testing site in Washington Heights, really, but with Somos and Congressmember Espaillat and Edonis Rodriguez and Robert Jackson, to really try to help those in the Latino community. The city has opened up a site right here in Central Harlem at Renaissance, and that site is open, and people are going to be encouraged to walk in and get tested. I know the state has a site that's opening up shortly as well, And so, we are pushing to make sure that people get tested, and they get tested in a way where they don't need a doctor's note. Because if you need a doctor's note, then you have to have a doctor, and that gets you into some of the issues. Not everyone has a doctor. Some members of our community use the emergency room as their doctor. So
Mm-hmm.
we wanted to kind of take that piece out of it. The city also is embarking on a $10 million ad campaign into sort of to community outreach, particularly in communities of color, different languages, just to kind of give people
Exactly.
the
Yeah.
information they need. The public
Mm-hmm.
education piece of this is so important.
Right.
We still have parts of our community where people are not social distancing. So there's overspread in certain communities just because of the information not either getting to the right people, or the people are getting it and are not taking it seriously. So, but you still got to deal with all of that, because you can
Right.
have a lot of rules and a lot of
Mm-hmm.
plans of how you keep people safe, but if people don't follow them and no one's holding that plan accountable,
Right.
you end up with bad results. And so that has to be part of your plan. Okay, we know in certain communities we might be seeing certain things happening. We've got to step up to the plate and make sure that we handle them accordingly, working with the right community leaders. And I'm part of doing an effort in Central Harlem to really try to make sure that we have the right community leaders, the tenant leaders, with the right
Mm-hmm.
information. Okay,
Right.
knowing which zip codes are hit the hardest, knowing where the testing sites are, knowing about the antibody testing, what's possible, making sure everyone has a mask, making sure people have the hand sanitizers, making sure people know how to wash their hands. You know, all of that sort of basic stuff. I think is important. Yeah, and that people take this seriously. And that's what we're trying to do out here. And if we do it well, uh, it won't be as bad as it could be.
Well, and then of course, again, many of these things are very low tech and not very expensive at all. So,
Nope.
a mask or a handkerchief or just staying 6 feet apart helps a lot. But the basic is in 90% of transmission cases, unless you're caught in an elevator or a very enclosed space, even social distancing is as important as making sure that you're washing your hands and not when you're touching contaminated surfaces, and that can go a long way. And you don't even need hand sanitizers for that; just soap and water. But it's a little
Soap and
more
water.
inconvenient.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, absolutely.
So the but what I do find interesting, especially looking at the numbers that are coming in New York City, that despite a really catastrophic takeoff, that within the 2 week period, about 2 weeks after we entered into the what did you call it, pause, the state
New York pause.
New York pause, which is about the incubation period, you began to see a pretty radical drop
Absolutely.
mostly in hospitalizations, which was very interesting because
and
the
and and also intubations, which is important, right? Because once someone gets intubated and they're in a ICU bed, it
hmm
gets really tough.
well the intubation, which is to before they when they're put onto a ventilator, and ventilators
Ventilator.
can.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
well, no, but intubation is the proper medical term. So we expect you to know that because you're the senator. So they have so
My point is, I want to keep people off these ventilators. If we keep them off their ventilators, the chance of them staying alive are higher, right? 80% of those who end up on a ventilator
don't
stay
make
on a
it.
ventilator in a negative way. So we want to try to reduce that. And I think, look, there's no doubt about the fact that if we had taken the coronavirus more seriously from the beginning and we really went into lockdown immediately, which would have drove people crazy, we'd have better numbers. But I think we did the best we could with the information we had. And I can't speak to what the president knew or didn't know. Feels to me that the president should have known better than the rest of us, and taking this more seriously. I thought he was running around at campaign rallies acting like it's a joke, calling it a hoax and these kinds of things. And I think we lost time off of that. But hey, hopefully people will remember that in November. But in the meantime, we got to do the best we can to save lives and keep people fed and and there's a lot of mental health issues going on right now. Norm,
Right.
people are so depressed. Losing loved ones, not being able to bury your family members. I mean,
Hmm.
think about all of that, right? You know, people are dying. You can't be there when they die. They're in a hospital. I had a resident call me saying that she wanted me to make sure that her mother was at a funeral because they told her that's where her mother was, and she called the funeral home, couldn't get anyone on the phone, and just wanted me to be able to verify that her mother who had passed away because of COVID-19 was where they told her she was because she couldn't be part of the process. I mean, that's a lot of mental health, depression, trauma, anxiety, and that's going to be part of what we have to deal with here. Domestic violence cases I'm hearing are up 15 to 20%, just because of what's going on. I mean, we got a lot that's tied to this, and we're gonna have a long road out. But we really got to try to stabilize the mess, flatten the curve, bring hospitalization numbers down, and try to smartly open back up the state and the country.
Well, I will ask one question because I always like to play equal time with both sides. So yes, I will take your word on the president's behavior, but we did have, and I'm not asking for comment on this, but we did have a health commissioner, chair of the health committee, and a mayor who were running around telling people in February that and in fact even into March, that everything was fine and that they should go to Lunar New Year and have a wonderful time at a mass party. So my reaction with most of this is that
Yeah,
but there are a lot of people who would prefer that they had not said what they said at the time. Part of it is
I agree.
there's a lot of misleading information that was put out and most likely intentionally by the Chinese government, and so
Probably.
people didn't know. Even Dr. Fauci, who I think we can all agree upon is a noted expert and someone who's been very aggressive in this fight. Uh, Even he, up until the first or the second week of February, thought it was a minimal impact. But that was because they were told by WHO and by the Chinese that it didn't. Well, I would say the Chinese government that we really didn't have to worry about this. There was not too much. It was not too much human to human transmission. It was mostly from the animal to human. All of that turned out to be ridiculous. So,
Well,
but what I
Norm, one of the things that I remember when this first came out, people were comparing it to, it was sort of like the flu, right? So we
right.
all kind of have a sense, oh, it's like the flu. Okay, it's a problem, but you don't, we need a vaccine. But I agree. I remember the earlier stages of this, I didn't even take it as seriously as ultimately it started to come by in terms of myself. I mean, because I was like,
Hmm.
oh, the coronavirus, but the way it was being discussed. Look, if we social distance, we bump elbows. Remember the bumping elbows? We were all showing how that worked. If we just did some of these kind of fundamental things, that we'll be all right. And then obviously it's turned out to be much worse than that, and we've had to recalibrate and take it more seriously.
Well, part of the problem is that it's a very unusual virus. I mean, it's a SARS variant. As I said
Right.
before, it's actually SARS-CoV-2 is the actual official term for it now. And the problem with this is you are getting um, a highly infectious disease because of the because it's a corona type of virus. It's like a cold virus, very easy to transmit. But in addition, it's very stealthy because you don't half of the people show no symptoms at all, and yet they're shedding the
Right.
virus. And
That's the biggest problem. We don't know who has it. It's hard for you to know if you have it.
And worse yet, even if they show mild to normal flu symptoms, which is another 40%, they actually are contagious and shedding the virus several days before they actually display the symptoms. So that we only learned because you had enclosed studies, which were the 100% testing on cruise ships. And those cruise ships taught us a lot. That's why the CDC made a 180 on face masks, because now it was a problem of you don't know who's contagious. So once they thought before you display symptoms, then you self-quarantine. Now they're realizing all of these people are walking around with no knowledge and they're spreading the virus. So it's a very unpleasant disease for that reason. And then, of course, you get ARDS in a few people, and that's what actually kills them. So they get acute respiratory distress syndrome, and the lungs the whole body gets into an attack mode on its own organs, so that it's trying too hard to get rid of the virus. So it's been very difficult and difficult on the care workers. And everyone will say something like 85% of the people who actually die from this virus are over 60. But then you get this occasional person who's a 35-year-old person in wonderful health, and then they die from the virus. It's very iffy. So I think everybody. The point I'm trying to say is I think we should be very proud of the response that the country has made as a whole, and the way that New Yorkers have handled this, because there's no panic. There's no one running around robbing the stores or looting anything. People are very calmly going about this and listening to our healthcare officials trying to cooperate. And sure, we're scared, but I don't think we have the usual problems you might expect. The one thing that concerns me is a policy issue. Is I'm a little concerned at the lack of preparedness, both on the city level, on the state level, and as we found out recently, in the strategic stockpile. So I know you're not federal, so you can't do anything about that. But the ventilators were bought and then auctioned under Bloomberg, and then auctioned off and never replaced. We had masks and gowns and gloves, and they were sold off because they expired and never replaced. And then even when 1,500 ventilators were recommended by the hospital, the hospital, not the committee, but the hospital organization for the state. In the case of a pandemic, we would need 1,500. None of these things, that was back in 2015. Nobody bought them. So is there some way that this can be legislated in which there's a requirement to make sure that that they report to the state assembly about the condition of our strategic stockpiles for managing this type of a health crisis?
Hey, Norm, it is really hard to hear you. Very, very hard to hear you. But let me just say,
how's that?
Much better. But,
right. That's because the microphone is set up so that it kills sound after a few feet, so you don't get background noise. So if I drift away from the mic, then you don't hear me because I'm just background. So anyway, go ahead. So I'm concerned about the fact that we had an opportunity to buy ventilators. We had studies from the hospital association and the governing board suggesting that we buy them. They weren't bought. We had ventilators that were purchased by Bloomberg in 2008. They were sold off because, for a valid reason, in 2016, because they no longer manufactured and the parts would be too expensive, but then they were never replaced. Neither were masks and gowns and other things in the stockpile. Is there some mechanism by which we can introduce some sort of legislation to require some kind of reporting on what the conditions are of these kinds of strategic stores?
So Norm, one of the things I'm looking into is just that. The issue is that there's a belief that the Defense Production Act doesn't give room for state action on that matter,
Right.
and that what ultimately we need to do is we really need to convince either the president to take on this role of sort of managing the ventilator purchases for the country, and obviously dealing with the international supply chain around these tests, and or for the governors of the states, which is going to be complicated, to work together
Right.
to sort of buy ventilators as a block. As
Hmm.
you know, sometimes the state of New York is competing against the federal government and the state of the California at the same time for these purchases, which is just completely ridiculous, right? So there's no reason why we shouldn't be doing that together. But unfortunately, given our council's interpretation of the Defense Production Act, it is very difficult for the state to assert itself
Right.
as it relates to that. Now, what can happen and has been happening is outreach to companies to try to encourage them to do this, right? Like that's something that I know the governor has been working on, and he has the real weight to do that. But it's not something that legislatively we believe we have any real authority because of the Defense Production Act, which we believe that the President of the United States should be aggressively trying to figure out how to utilize to help deal with these very issues.
Well, you get run into a. Yes, you're correct that the Defense Production Act is definitely a. It really was considered to be a wartime power, so that you could
Right,
marshal resources in the case of a national emergency.
which this
uh,
is. We're in
right,
war,
and
and this is a this is a national emergency.
right. So that's why they were able to execute it. In fact, it was developed under Truman. So of course, at that time, people were worried about being invaded by the Russians. So in this case, I agree with you. It would be good to have some kind of a cooperative buying scheme where all these purchases could go through some kind of centralized federal program where the states then can then purchase the product through the federal government, and then the federal government would use its uh, size
Purchasing
and
power.
your
Yeah.
purchasing power
every
to
state
negotiating
every state will be
better terms.
required to provide to the
Hmm.
federal government uh, what their needs are, and the federal government buys it for everyone and then distributes it. I mean, that is basic stuff, but you know,
Well, then you get into the question of do the individual states and would our own state agree to cede that power to the federal government and say that we will buy through you, as opposed to going
I
out
think
on
they
our
would.
own.
I think they would. Why? Because when they're competing against each other, they're driving up the price against each other. Of course, they would do it. I think they would do it in a heartbeat. I think if the president agreed to take that on and work with the National Governors Association, Republicans and Democratic states, I think that they would definitely do it.
Well,
But
certainly
obviously,
in
I'm not a
this,
governor, so I can't state. I can't speak for them. But I mean,
right.
I'm positive the governor of this state would do it.
Well, definitely it's pointed out to people. We often learn when things don't go right what is good policy, because we see the consequences of poorly architected policy. So who would have known that? Who would have realized that this would have been this type of a problem? And then, of course, we have a whole problem basically ceding our production chain to a strategic production chain to outside
I
of the
agree.
country, which makes it very hard
There's
to
no
ramp up
reason,
production.
Norm. There's no reason whatsoever why these reagents are being produced in China. This is this should be U.S. produced. These reagents, all the testing equipment that is needed for us to ramp up supply, that should be a U.S. function. That should not be something that we have to rely on China and others to provide the fundamental materials that we need in order to test, ramp up testing in this country, given the level of national emergency around this problem.
Well, again, quoting the Defense Production Act, that's why you have GM apparently kicking and screaming, going in and producing ventilators now, and we'll have many more ventilators than we had when we started this, and that's why I suspect that they'll have to do something with them. Now they've ramped up production, and they'll end up putting them out into the make sure that the states have stockpiles that are necessary, and probably share them with other countries, of which were our allies who are
Right.
suffering right now, don't have that kind of productive capacity. But it is true, there's been absolutely no reason why 95% of our basic antibiotics are made in China. Absolutely no
Right.
reason, absolutely. And it's not that expensive to make these products because these are not labor-intensive processes. These are basically
Right.
large cooking processes. So I don't see the reason for this except that, well, we'll see a correction in trade policy after this is over, I'm certain, so that these types of supply chains are brought back to the United States so that we are able to respond quickly and just in time when we need new products and turn it on a dime to get that kind of production going. Right now, as you might think, with a supply chain that stretches across the Pacific, even if you made the products, how are you going to get them here? Then you're going to you have transit times that you have to deal with and batching, and it gets very complicated when you have these global supply chains. So, yeah, I agree with you. So let me ask this one question then before we break, because we're, as is usual, even though we began a little late, the hour is practically run out. And you look, by the way,
Right.
as far as the people who've been on our program, as we have little kinks that we have to work out. You have the best camera. You have looked absolutely wonderful on this camera, and your audio is terrific. So
Thank you.
it must be your engineering guy Luther who helped you with all that. So
Yeah.
Luther is
Luther's
terrific.
great.
So look, I expect that the country will be very different after this experience, in many ways much better. So what do you think are some key areas in which policy is going to change? Obviously, we're talking about reliance upon foreign sources for fundamental strategic items like drugs and health equipment, and maybe better coordination for purchasing between the states via centralized federal acquisition program. What else would you see that might be different?
First of all, Norm, thank you for this conversation. Thank you for being so focused on topics that really matter in our community, and I appreciate all of the hard work that you provide in this district. So, in closing, let me say, listen. I think this is a new normal for all of us. I think the way we look at work is going to have to be different. There's no reason why, in some cases, people who have been going to work at some office building can't do more work from home. I
Mm-hmm.
think that we should think a little bit more thoughtfully about that. I think education and schooling, it's how we deal with those issues. There's a lot of lessons to be learned from this. I believe that how we shop is going to continue to move away from brick and mortar.
Right.
It's one thing to have sort of the hipsters and those sort of super savvy doing buying all of their supplies and goods on social media. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
off the internet. It's a whole other thing when the whole economy is forced to do it. What does the world look like when you turn the corner on that, right? There is really going to be, in my opinion, a lot more sort of acceptance of you know internet based communication, right? So there were some
Right.
things that I just was on a fundraiser for a nonprofit earlier, they said they raised more money in in that fundraiser this year than they raised last year. And so all of a sudden now people are going to start thinking about how we communicate and what are the requirements of those communications in a whole different light. And I think that is directly related to this. And I think what we want to do is this was a horrible situation. This is a horrible situation. We're going to try to get through this. But the things that we've learned from this, the things that, you say, wait a minute, well, why did we do it that way? Why don't we do it this way? I think there's going to be more of that occurs than we believe, and there will be major shifts to the economy as a result. And so, thank you again for this conversation. I appreciate you, and I look forward to us continuing the conversation in the future.
Well, thank you very much. And this closes our program, Manhattan Policy Forum Update. We will be back tomorrow at 1 o'clock when we will be going over some new opportunities for assistance in locating surgical masks and sanitizing equipment, and help with food for the elderly and shut-ins. We will be, to remind you, we will be on April. The forum will be back on Thursday, April 30th at 7 p.m. Our three guests on the panel discussing the New York State budget process is Senator Brian Benjamin, Senator Robert Jackson, and Assemblyman Dan Quart. We look forward to seeing you there. You can join us as you do on these broadcasts at ManhattanPolicyForum.org, live at Grant on YouTube, and at 95.9 FM, Grant Houses Community Radio. So thank you for tuning in, and we will see you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Okay.